Hi all. Sorry for getting this posted so late today, but it hopefully will be a fairly brief lecture, really. And if you've already read the chapter, hopefully the chapter just kind of made sense on its own. I mean, it should be a lot easier than some of the material that we've read in this class. There's actually kind of a funny story about it, I guess. The chapter, if you looked at the first few sections of the chapter, they're about this famous argument by this guy named Garrett Hardin, who he thinks, he says, well, look, it's actually bad to give charitable aid to people in need in poor nations because the world is overpopulated. You're just making the problem worse. It's like if you had a lifeboat and you thought that you could bring just everybody drowning into the lifeboat, even though that's going to sink the boat. You have to only let in the amount of people that the boat can support, even though other people are going to die. It's quite a ruthless argument, and it's also just sort of empirically incorrect. I mean, the world, can support the number of people that there are, and to the extent that it can't, it's basically because of excessive resource use by people in wealthy nations, right? And even though the world population has continued increasing in recent years, the amount of people in dire poverty has decreased. Furthermore, I mean, as economic growth happens in developing nations, the birth rate tends to go down because people get better access to contraception, that sort of stuff. So, really, Hardin's argument just doesn't work, just kind of on empirical grounds. And I was asked to join the book project. I wasn't the only author of that textbook that this chapter came from, but I was asked to join the book project after the original version of this chapter had already been written. And originally it was just all about this Garrett Hardin argument. And I thought that was very silly because the conceit of the textbook is we're portraying everything in an impartial way, right? And why are we going to try to give an impartial portrayal of this argument that not only is very sinister, but is just empirically wrong? Well, whatever, they had already written it. And then a few days, and this is discussed in the chapter as it exists now, a few days before the book manuscript was due, before we were supposed to give it to the publisher for them to publish it, I learned that Garrett Hardin was like a white nationalist. And that's why he holds some of the views that he does. These are influencing his views about charitable aid and global development and this sort of thing. And so I thought, look, we really can't have a chapter just trying to impartially discuss this awful argument from this racist guy. And I went to the other authors, and some of them agreed with me. Some of them said, wait a minute, though, we don't have time to change it at this point. Like, you're going to throw out the chapter with this little time left. So I said, look, I'll do it. By tomorrow, I'll have you a new chapter. So I went through, and I just, I switched it so that we just said, look, the Garrett Hardin thing, this is a terrible argument, and he's like a racist guy and very bad. Like, don't listen to that. And then I wrote all of this stuff about the institutional critique between 7 p.m. one day and 1 p.m. the next day. So this was a rush job on my part, but it made it into the book, and I don't really think what I wrote is bad or anything. So that's what we're going to talk about. So this is discussing the thing you read was written by me. It's discussing the institutional critique of what's called effective altruism. We'll talk about what that is in a second. The main author that we interact with is Amiya Srinivasan, who has presented a version of this institutional critique. She's an interesting person. She was born in Bahrain. Her parents were Indian, and she since has lived in many different places. Like I said, she teaches in Oxford. She recently had a book of like feminist essays on sex that came out that got a lot of popular media attention and stuff. If you're interested, you can Google that, I guess. So it's a textbook reading by me, but it's trying to discuss her argument. You can look up, she had a piece in the London Review of Books that you could look up and find if you want to read her direct discussion of it. It's a little, because it's like a popular piece and is not trying to really distill down what is the exact argument, it's a little hard to fill in some of the details of what the critique is if you just read her piece, I think. And so that's why I assigned this textbook that's trying to clarify, what is she saying in that piece. But it's worth reading if you're interested in this topic. It's worth reading the original piece too. It's a lot longer than what I assigned you. Both the piece from Singer that you read and the book chapter from me that you read are located kind of broadly within this movement known as effective altruism. If you Google that, effective altruism, you'll find all sorts of stuff about it. This is a movement. It encourages people to do as much good as they can. So it's called altruism because it's about doing good. It's called effective because it's about, let's use evidence, reason, to figure out what is the most effective way to do good. If I give money to this charity, will I do more good than if I give money to this charity? That sort of thing. If I go into this career, will I do more good than if I go into this career, etc. So 80,000 Hours, this organization that I talked about in my chapter, that's an effective altruist organization. They're trying to let's use evidence to figure out which career path will actually allow you to do the most good, help the most people, right? Don't just go on the basis of, that sounds nice. Really try to figure out how you can do the most good. Effective altruism in principle could be applied to any question, right? Where should you shop? How should you spend your free time? Anything, right? Because it's all about just doing good in any means. But a lot of the movement has focused on this question about which charities are the most effective and how can we get people to donate to them. Because it's been very influenced by Singer. And some of Singer's writings about poverty and charity and your obligation to give to charity. Okay. The institutional critique is a critique of the effective altruist movement. And somehow or other it says that the focus on private charity is misguided. It's called the institutional critique because it says instead of focusing on private charitable giving, you should be focused on institutional reform. Or maybe at least you should be more focused than you are on institutional reform. As we're going to see, there are different ways to spell out exactly what this critique is. Now, it's important to get Garrett Hardin, this other guy, this racist guy, who thinks we're in a big lifeboat. He's against charitable giving, right? Proponents of the institutional critique are not against charitable giving. They say, yeah, it's a good thing. Amia Srinivasan, actually, in her London Review of Books piece, she mentions she read this book by Will MacAskill, who's an effective altruist guy. If you look in the footnotes of my article, I cite him a few times. She read this book by Will MacAskill, and that actually caused her to set up a recurring donation to give directly, and that's an organization that gives money to people in Uganda and Kenya, focused on poor communities. It's one of the GiveWell, I showed you GiveWell. It's one of the GiveWell top charities. You can give money to give directly, and they'll distribute it directly to people in need. I guess Srinivasan thinks that's a good thing to do because she decided to donate some of her money. But proponents of the institutional critique think somehow the emphasis is wrong. Yeah, it's nice to give money to charity, but the effective altruist movement and people like Singer have focused too much on charity and not enough on other things. Political and social and institutional questions. So to get a sense of what the ground of the critique is, you might think about the United States 100 years ago versus today. Think about the state of poverty in the U.S. 100 years ago versus today. Now, of course, there's still poverty, but things were a lot worse 100 years ago. There was lots of child labor. Worker conditions were much less safe. Workers had to work much longer hours. Ordinary workers, without any minimum wage or other sorts of labor protections. There wasn't any social security, so it was much more common for elderly people to be impoverished. There wasn't any social safety net for the unemployed or people who got injured and couldn't work or anything like this. And just in general, people were less wealthy 100 years ago. So there's plenty of room for improvement. I mean, let's not, airbrush anything. But things have gotten better, right? Better probably to be an ordinary worker in the U.S. today than 100 years ago. At least for lots of people. Well, how did that happen, though? It wasn't because some nice people in another country set up a charity and made a bunch of donations, right? Two things happened instead. For one thing, the economy has grown a lot over the last 100 years. And that economic growth was enabled by certain sorts of institutions. So, for instance, usually in the U.S., if you own a business, you don't need to bribe government officials, say, or you don't need to worry about other people breaking contracts with you and you not being able to get the contract enforced, something like that. The institutions have prevented, say, civil wars from breaking out or other major forms of social instability. Maybe we're getting closer in the U.S., but at least so far, past 100 years, no civil wars have broken out, and so forth. And these things have allowed for economic growth. If there had been a big civil war, it would have wiped out a lot of that stuff, right? So there were certain institutions that promoted, again, not perfectly, but promoted stability, the rule of law, this sort of thing, and that enables economic growth. And you have a lot of economic growth, then you have less poverty, right? At least, things don't always get distributed equally, of course. But tends to be the case, more economic growth, then people in general are going to have more money. And second, we had a lot of policy changes to help address a lot of the specific problems that we mentioned, right? You have labor laws that outlawed child labor, that mandated safer working conditions, that established a minimum wage, that mandate overtime if somebody works too much. All sorts of things like that. Established Social Security, established unemployment insurance, disability insurance, welfare. I mean, all sorts of stuff, right? So again, plenty of problems. But things have gotten a lot better, or at least they've gotten, somewhat better. And that hasn't really been because nice people in other countries set up charities. It's been because of institutions and institutional changes. It's been because of, say, policy changes that implemented new programs that made things better. Also, the amount of... Whoops, sorry. I accidentally kicked a box. The amount of extreme poverty in the world over the past few decades has gone down a lot. And that largely has been because it's gone down a lot in East Asia. In China, in South Korea, and Taiwan, Japan. Much less extreme poverty than there used to be. Still some, but much less than there used to be. Why did that happen? Well, that wasn't because nice people in the West sent donations to China or something. It was because the governments in those countries pursued certain policies that led to a lot of economic development. Sometimes Western governments didn't want them to, actually. There's a little book I cite about this in the chapter. But they did, led to a lot of economic development. There's been a lot less growth in sub-Saharan Africa. Why is that? Well, probably part of the story is you had European colonialism for quite a long time. And then when the Europeans left, they left behind sort of weak and fractured institutions that couldn't implement policies like this. And so it's much harder to bring about economic growth of the sort that can eliminate poverty, right? And so it looks like, the biggest and most lasting progress against poverty, whether in the U.S. or in the world in general or whatever, seems to come from good government policies. Policies that take care of people in need, that protect workers, that protect vulnerable people, that lead to wealth and economic growth being created, while also making sure that the wealth can get distributed to people, doesn't just get controlled by some oligarchs, some rich billionaires and stuff. And in light of that, in light of the fact that, well, really the biggest progress against poverty seems to have been made through kind of government action and social action, through changes in institutions and in policies, you might think, well, it's kind of weird that the Singer solution to world poverty, as this piece in the book is called, is just, well, you should give all your money to charity, right? To some charity that's going to distribute bed nets or something. What about if institutional change is kind of the big driving factor in eliminating poverty? Why is that not what Singer and the effective altruists are talking about? Why are they talking about sort of private charities that are just kind of trying to address, maybe address symptoms of poverty or something like that, you might think. And of course, before I was giving examples about countries changing their internal domestic policies. The U.S. instituting minimum wage laws, that sort of stuff. You might think, well, when we're talking about global poverty, because, most of the worst poverty is located in other places. There is very bad poverty in the U.S. too, but most of the worst poverty is located in other countries. You might think, well, but, what can I do to affect political institutions in other countries, right? But, well, the world is much more connected than it used to be. There are international institutions that regulate trade and, all sorts of economic relationships. The U.S. government does all sorts of stuff to influence the internal policies of other countries, provides all sorts of foreign aid. So there are things you can do that would influence what sorts of international institutions exist, that to some extent would influence what sorts of policies exist in other countries. I mean, maybe you worry about meddling in the affairs of other countries, and that's an important concern, but maybe you could at least stop your own country from meddling in the affairs of other countries, to help some corporation move in and, whatever. And this is all going to set the stage for Srinivasan's version of the institutional critique. So she brings up, I think, two main points that are going to factor into her version of the institutional critique. One is about ignorance. The idea is that effective altruism somehow or other encourages us to ignore certain important facts about institutions. And the other is about uncertainty. And the idea there is, because effective altruism is so focused on, let's use evidence to figure out what's the most effective way. Effective altruists tend to not be so interested in courses of action where there's a lot of uncertainty about how much good you'll do, or where it seems almost impossible to tell, like, what are the odds that this will succeed, or that sort of thing. And efforts at large-scale political change, institutional reform, those are things where there's a whole lot of uncertainty. It's easy maybe to quantify, okay, how much does an anti-malaria bed net cost, blah, blah, blah. Very hard to quantify, how much, what are our chances of getting the minimum wage raised, or getting a new trade policy enacted, this sort of thing. And she thinks these two things together sort of encourage effective altruists to not work so much on institutional reform. The ignorance problem discourages them from realizing that it's necessary. The uncertainty problem encourages them to focus on things that are easier to measure, easier to quantify. Even if they realize that institutional reforms would be nice, they tend to focus on other things that are, you can kind of figure out exactly how much good you're going to do more easily. So we'll talk about these two criticisms in turn. So about the ignorance thing, Srinivasan thinks that effective altruism has been a conservative movement, not in the sense of, being populated by Republicans or something like that, but in the sense that it tends to just sort of treat the world as we find it as a given, almost, right? It sort of treats, when you read somebody like Singer, he says, okay, look, there's all this poverty, people in dire need, what can we do about it? Okay, well, let's, provide some vitamins for children so that they can survive and be healthy and blah, blah, blah. Ship them some anti-malaria bed nets, that sort of stuff. But doesn't kind of interrogate the deeper sources of all this, right? The effective altruists aren't talking about international trade and finance, debt, nationalism, imperialism, racial and gender-based subordination, war, environmental degradation, corruption, exploitation of labor. Exploitation of labor. All of these kind of deep structural institutional problems that are creating these problems that we see. She thinks, look, when you read somebody like Singer, he's not trying to understand how power works, except to better align himself with it. You might understand how power works so that you can figure out how to get a high-paying Wall Street finance job or something, right? You might try to understand how power works so that you can get power and wield it to do good, so you think. But it's not, when you read Singer, because he's trying to bring about deep changes in institutions. Or at least, I should say, in fairness to Singer, at least this might be the impression you get from the article that you read. He does talk in other places about foreign aid and that sort of stuff, so maybe I'm being a little unfair to him in even characterizing the discussion in these terms. But you could at least get that impression if you just read the article that you guys read. And so in this sense, she's thinking effective altruism leaves everything just as it is. It leaves sort of the structures that are causing problems in place and just focuses on, okay, how can we kind of minimize the damages that they're doing? And so, the basic thought here is like the focus on charitable giving, the focus on private individual action that is aimed at, helping people who are in need. That's sort of ultimately going to kind of encourage you to work within the system without trying to change anything. So you might be excited about the opportunity to take some high-paying job. Maybe you're not thinking about the global finance forces, say, that allow you to get this high-paying job or that make the job pay so much, that sort of stuff, while also impoverishing some other people. And then she also thinks that this effective altruist focus on quantifiable, evidence-based courses of action, that's going to discourage you from attempts at institutional reform because it can be very difficult to evaluate in advance, what are your chances of success, how much good are you going to do, etc. What's the expected marginal value of becoming an anti-capitalist revolutionary? You need to decide, we're trying to achieve an unrecognizably different world, one with unrecognizably different sorts of people. How good would that be? How many malaria nets is that worth? What are the chances of that? How can we put that into an equation and figure out, what's the expected difference made by becoming an anti-capitalist revolutionary trying to radically reorganize society? And I guess her concern is effective altruists who are focused on, okay, let's look at the evidence, figure out what's the most effective way. Her concern is they might say, well, there's just no way to figure out what the expected value of taking this course of action is, and so they won't do it. They'll go focus on working on Wall Street and making a bunch of money to give to charity, something like that. Something that, in a certain sense, is easier because it involves, working within the system and that kind of thing. So, in light of those points, we might put the institutional critique something like this. Premise 1, effective altruism discourages efforts at institutional reform. Premise 2, institutional reform is really the best way to help people in need. But premise 3, if effective altruism discourages efforts at the best way to help people in need, then it's problematic. So it's problematic. Now, some of these premises are a little bit vague, maybe. I mean, what exactly does it mean to say that it's problematic? Does it mean also we shouldn't try to do the most good? Does it mean, maybe the principle of effective altruism is right, but there's something, the way that effective altruists have gone about it, that people like Singer have gone about it, that's not quite right. Well, maybe we can make it a little bit more precise as we spell out some of these, some possible objections that one might have, right? Now, one problem you might raise is this. Look, effective altruism, it's trying to tell us, okay, how can we do the most good, right? But who is we here? I mean, what matters for me is how can I do the most good? What matters for you is how you can do the most good, right? We need to think, each of us needs to think, how can we do the most good, right? I can't control what other people do. I can't control global institutions. Maybe some people can. Joe Biden, maybe Elon Musk, some really rich people. So maybe they can have an impact on global institutions. But you and I can't. So maybe this misses the point. I mean, yeah, it's nice to think about what if these institutions were different, but it doesn't have any practical upshot. Because that's not up to me. All I can think about is what's up to me. And what's up to me is the fact that, given that we maybe have bad global institutions or whatever, or suboptimal, imperfect global institutions at least, there are people in need and I can help some of them. Jeff McMahon, and we'll read something by him later about a different topic, I think. He defends the effective altruist approach along these lines. Look, I'm not a state, right? I'm not a government. I can only determine what I will do, not what the government will do. I could decide to concentrate my efforts on changing my state's institutions or changing global economic institutions, but the probability of my making a difference to the lives of badly impoverished people may be substantially lower if I adopt this course than if I undertake more direct action unmediated by the state. In other words, he's saying, look, I just need to think about what I can do. Now, one thing I could do is maybe try to influence, what the World Bank's policies are or something like that. But he's probably not going to be able to do that, though. If I focus on that kind of thing, probably not going to do any good. Maybe I should focus more on, maybe it makes perfect sense for me to focus on, just helping people who are in need directly through my charity or whatever, because that's something I can actually control. What should Srinivasan say to this? Well, for one thing, maybe she could appeal to an ethical theory that doesn't ask me to consider just the direct consequences of my action, but asks me to consider the consequences of collective action. We saw, for instance, rule utilitarianism is like this, right? The act utilitarian says, think about which action will do the most good. The rule utilitarian says, think about the rules that would do the most good if people generally followed them and follow those rules. Promise keeping, maybe, there are lots of situations where keeping a promise doesn't do the most good, but if people in general break promises every time, it won't do the most good. That's going to be bad in the aggregate because the institution will break down, right? You might think in a similar way, look, think about all these people who fought for institutional change in the US and other places over the past century. If they had just said, well, look, I could fight for institutional change, but my chance of making any difference is extremely small. I mean, I'm not going to affect this. I should just focus on, raising money for elderly people in poverty instead of trying to institute Social Security or whatever. Well, I mean, there's a certain sense to that, maybe. But if they had all thought that, then we would be worse off, wouldn't we? We wouldn't have all these changes and these good programs that have done a lot of good and probably have done a lot more good than just people, fundraising would have done or whatever. So if she appeals to a theory like this, rule utilitarianism or maybe Kantianism or contractualism, they have similar features. You might think, look, I need to think about kind of playing my part in this collective scheme that's aimed at bringing about good changes. And even if I think, I personally am not going to make a difference probably, well, I'll still be part of this big cooperative effort that maybe does make a difference, hopefully. And, if everybody just thinks, well, I'm not going to make a difference, then nothing's going to happen, right? Maybe there's also a way for her to appeal to act utilitarian reasoning. okay, maybe the chance that I make a difference is really low, but maybe it would be really, really good if I did. I mean, if I actually did change the World Bank's policies or whatever, that could be really huge, right? So maybe it makes sense in those terms. And that brings up kind of a second possible objection. What is the expected value, she asks, the expected marginal value of becoming an anti-capitalist revolutionary? Well, maybe we actually do have a way to determine that. And effective altruists should just crunch the numbers and see if that does more or less good than whatever else. Economists and people doing game theory and ethicists and so forth will use what's called cost-benefit analysis, or an expected utility calculation. What you do here is you take the probability for any the book maybe puts it in a slightly confusing way, because it could be that you have like multiple costs and multiple benefits, and then the equation would need to be longer. You need to have like B1, B2, etc. But the idea is you figure out what are the possible costs. You multiply the size of the cost by the probability of the cost. And then you take, what are the possible benefits, and you multiply the size of the benefit by the probability of the benefit. So, in a case where, I'm not going to quiz you on the specific math, I'm just explaining how this works, so you have an idea of what the suggestion is. When it comes to the specific math, let's consider a case where you get offered a bet. I'm going to flip a fair coin. If the coin lands heads, I pay you $2. If it lands tail, you pay me $1. So the way we're going to figure this out is, we figure, look, you're wondering whether to take this bet. You should figure, look, there's a 50% chance that you get $2. So you take 0.5 times 2. There's a 50% chance that you lose $1, so you take 0.5 times minus 1, so you get 1 plus negative 0.5, so the expected value is 0.5. So the expected value of taking the bet, in other words, is 50 cents. What that means, one way to think about what that means in the long run is like, if we played this game 1 billion times, in the long run, on average, you would expect to make about 50 cents per time that we played, right? If we played it 1 billion times, in the end, you'd have about $500 million. And so, because the expected value of taking the bet is positive, you should expect to make 50 cents every time you play. Okay, you should take the bet. Maybe we can do the same thing with the question about becoming a revolutionary. Let's figure out all the possible costs. You get executed by the capitalists. Let's figure out the possible benefits. Let's figure out what the odds of each of those are. Do the math. Figure out what the expected value is. Figure out, is that higher than the expected value of working on Wall Street and giving the money to buy malaria bed nets. Okay, so really, we can address uncertainty. And Srinivasan thinks, no, not really. I mean, maybe in principle, there are numbers that could be assigned to all this, but there's no actual way to assign the numbers, right? There's no real way to figure out what is the value of the unrecognizably different world, or the probability of achieving it. And she even thinks, maybe this is just going to tell us what we want to hear, Maybe it just kind of gives a false patina of precision, because I think I'm using math and evidence and all this stuff, but like the numbers are just made up. So, maybe I think, cushy job on Wall Street. It turns out that's way better than anti-capitalist revolutionary, because maybe that's what I want to hear, right? And then here's a third possible objection. Okay, so maybe working for institutional change is very important. But you can do that and give away your money, right? If nothing else, you could give away your money to some organization that's working for political change, to some activist organization or some lobbying organization. So you don't necessarily have to choose. You might have to choose to some extent. I mean, you know, do you want to become a full-time activist, or do you want to take the Wall Street job and make a lot of, okay, you got to choose then. But in many contexts, you don't have to choose. You know, when you're deciding, should you spend this money on a vacation or give it to the Against Malaria Foundation, it will, I mean, what, you know, okay, but, you know, the real problem is with institutions. Okay, well, that's interesting, but that's not a justification for you taking the vacation, is it? That doesn't tell us anything about that. You still have this question, do I want to let the kid die or take the vacation? And yeah, maybe we should be working for institutions, but that doesn't tell you anything, does it? Furthermore, you might think it's okay for different people to have kind of different emphases, depending on their skills and their interests and stuff. Maybe some people should be focused on charity that alleviates, you know, suffering that's ongoing, and other people should be focused on reform that tries to eliminate the root causes of suffering. So McMahon here, again, defending effective altruism, says, yeah, of course it's best if people do both. They both directly help others through charity, and they try to bring about institutional change. But there has to be a certain division of labor. Some people taking direct action to address the plight of the most impoverished, others devoting their efforts to bringing about institutional change. To suppose the only acceptable option is to work to reform global economic institutions, and it's self-indulgent to try to directly help people in extreme poverty, would be like condemning a doctor who treats the victim of a war because the doctor is not instead trying to bring about a peace settlement, you know. This doctor is here, he's treating a civilian who's been wounded, and you say, what are you doing? You know, don't you realize that the war is the root cause of this person's injury? Like, you ought to be focusing on that, you know. Well, no, I mean, it's good that the doctor is there too, right? You know, it's okay if not everybody maybe is engaged in political activism all the time. And even the people who are, they should still be giving their money away. Because they can still do things to alleviate poverty directly. Or to alleviate, you know, death and suffering and all sorts of things, right? And I think, at least in principle, I mean, I don't know exactly what Srinivasan thinks about this, but, I mean, she does give money to give directly, I guess. But I think somebody leveling the institutional critique could sort of agree with this. I mean, like I said, they're not against charitable giving. They just sort of think Singer is maybe too focused on it, or something like that. The emphasis is wrong. So it turns out, yeah, maybe there is something to this institutional critique. Institutional reform, thinking about the root causes of problems, all this sort of stuff. That's important. Doesn't seem like it means that you don't have to give your money away, though. Sorry to say. It's still not an excuse for letting people suffer when you could help them with your disposable income. Yeah, that's what this is. That's this lecture. Have a nice weekend. Next Thursday, I'm going to post the midterm. Then you'll have a week to do that. Yeah.